I've been married to Lisa for 6 years, and I thought I knew every corner of her heart. I thought I knew the way she hummed while making coffee, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she laughed at her own jokes before the punchline even landed. I thought I knew her completely. I was wrong. The flood came on a Tuesday in October, the kind of storm that meteorologists had been warning about for days but nobody truly believed would be as bad as they said. The Millbrook River crested its banks at 3 in the morning, and by the time the emergency alert started screaming on our phones, the water was already lapping at the bottom of our porch steps. We lived in a low-lying neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place that real estate agents call charming and flood insurance agents call high risk. We'd bought our house 7 years ago, just before Lisa and I got married, and we'd never had serious flooding before. A little water in the basement once, nothing more. That night changed everything, though not in the way the flood was supposed to. I remember the exact moment it started. Lisa and I were both awake, moving fast, the way you do when adrenaline takes over and your body acts before your brain catches up. I was grabbing the important documents from the fireproof box in the closet, birth certificates, insurance papers, the deed to the house. Lisa was in the living room, and I could hear her moving around, pulling things off shelves. The water was rising fast. Our neighbor Dale had already knocked on the door to tell us his entire first floor was submerged, and the emergency services were saying to get to the second floor or evacuate entirely. "Lisa, we need to move," I called out, tucking the document folder under my arm. "Get the laptop, get your medications, we need to go upstairs or get out." "I'm getting things," she called back, her voice strained and breathless. I came out of the hallway into the living room, and that's when I saw it. Lisa was standing at the bookshelf near the fireplace, the one where we kept our photo albums and a few framed pictures. She was holding something carefully against her chest, cradling it the way you hold something precious and irreplaceable. For just a second, I thought she'd grabbed our wedding album, the big white leather-bound one we'd spent a small fortune on, the one that sat on the center shelf like a monument to the life we'd built together. But it wasn't our wedding album. It was a worn, faded blue photo album. One I'd never seen before. One that didn't belong on our shelf, or at least, I'd never noticed it there before. And our wedding album was still sitting on the shelf, water beginning to creep across the floor toward the base of the bookcase. "Lisa," I said, and something in my voice must have caught her attention, because she turned and looked at me, and I saw it, that flash of guilt, that microsecond of exposure before her expression rearranged itself into something neutral. "We have to go," she said. "What is that?" I asked. "Richard, the water, what is that album, Lisa?" She looked down at what she was holding, then back at me, then at our wedding album still sitting on the shelf. And I watched my wife make a calculation. I watched her decide, in real time, that the blue album in her arms was more important than our wedding pictures. She didn't reach back for the white album. She just looked at me with those eyes I thought I knew, and said, "It's just photos. Come on, we need to get upstairs." She walked past me toward the stairs. I stood there for 2 full seconds, I counted them, watching the water slide across our hardwood floors and begin to soak the bottom of the bookshelf. Then I grabbed our wedding album myself, tucked it under my other arm with the documents, and followed my wife upstairs. But something had broken open inside me. Something quiet and terrible. We spent that night on the second floor, listening to the water rise and then, slowly, stop rising. The flood peaked at about 14 inches inside our first floor, enough to destroy the furniture and the floors and most of what we'd left behind, but not enough to reach the second level. By dawn, emergency crews were moving through the neighborhood in boats, and by mid-morning the water had begun to recede. It left behind a brown, sinking film on everything it touched. Lisa and I barely spoke that morning. She told herself, and maybe tried to tell me, that it was stress, that we were both in shock over the house, that this was just the aftermath of a traumatic night. She held the blue album the entire night. She set it on the bed between us while we sat and waited out the water. She never opened it in front of me. But twice, in the gray pre-dawn hours, I caught her looking at it with an expression I'd never seen on her face when she looked at me. Something soft and aching. Something private. I saved our wedding album. It sat on the nightstand on my side of the bed, dry and safe, while my wife cradled a stranger's memories. When the water receded enough for us to move around downstairs, I started the cleanup process. Lisa's sister Jennifer came over to help, and a few neighbors stopped by. Lisa busied herself with throwing away ruined items, directing people, making calls to the insurance company. She was efficient and organized, the way she always was in a crisis. It was one of the things I'd always loved about her, her capability, her composure. Now I watched it with different eyes. I waited until Jennifer had taken Lisa out to get food and supplies before I went looking. The blue album was in the nightstand drawer on Lisa's side of the bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment before I opened it. Part of me didn't want to know. Part of me understood that once I saw what was inside, there was no going back to the comfortable lie of not knowing. I opened it. The first page held a photograph of Lisa, younger, maybe 23 or 24, her hair longer than she wore it now, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They were at some kind of outdoor festival, laughing, and his arm was around her waist in the easy, possessive way of someone who has held that waist 1,000 times. She was looking up at him rather than at the camera, and the expression on her face was radiant in a way that made my chest tighten. I turned the pages slowly. There were years of photographs. This man, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, conventionally handsome in an uncomplicated way, appeared in all of them with Lisa. Beach trips. Holiday dinners. What looked like his family's home. Lisa in his college sweatshirt. Lisa asleep on his couch with his dog. Lisa and this man at what appeared to be a formal event, her in a blue dress, him in a suit, his hand on the small of her back, both of them looking at each other rather than the camera. I found a name, eventually. On the back of one photograph, in Lisa's handwriting, me and Danny, New Year's, 2011. Danny. I'd never heard her mention a Danny. Not once in 8 years of knowing her, not once in 6 years of marriage. Not in any story about her past, not in any conversation about her exes. She'd told me about 2 boyfriends before me, a college relationship that ended amicably, a post-college relationship that ended badly. She'd never mentioned anyone named Danny. I sat with that album in my hands, in my flood-damaged house, and I understood that I did not actually know my wife. I put the album back exactly where I found it. I went downstairs and began ripping up waterlogged flooring. But I wasn't just cleaning up the house anymore. I was thinking. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I didn't make any accusations that first day. I didn't erupt or confront or demand answers while Jennifer was there and the neighbors were coming in and out and we were still in the raw middle of the crisis. Partly that was practicality. Mostly it was because I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I said a single word. I've always been methodical by nature. I'm a project manager for a commercial construction firm, and my entire professional life is built on not making moves until I have complete information. I applied that instinct now to the thing that was quietly destroying me. Over the next 3 days, as we stayed with Jennifer while our first floor was dried out and assessed, I started paying closer attention to everything. I paid attention to Lisa's phone. I wasn't the kind of husband who checked his wife's phone. I'd always believed that kind of surveillance was its own form of relationship poison, but I started noticing when she went out of her way to keep it face down, to angle the screen away from me, to leave the room to take calls she'd normally have taken in front of me. I paid attention to her schedule. She was a veterinarian with her own small practice, and her hours were usually predictable. But I started noticing small gaps, a lunch that ran long, an errand that took twice as long as it should have. A Wednesday evening she said she was having drinks with her colleague Patrice that Patrice accidentally referenced differently when I ran into her at the gas station. I paid attention to her emotions. The way she was sometimes distant at dinner, present in body but somewhere else entirely in her mind. The way she occasionally looked at her phone with an expression she tried to suppress but couldn't always hide in time. The way she'd started being slightly too careful around me, too conscientious, the way people are when guilt is making them work harder at normalcy. I hired a private investigator named Don Garrett on the 6th day after the flood. He came recommended by a colleague whose brother had used him during a business dispute, and he was professional, quiet, and thorough. I told him what I needed. He told me it would take 2 weeks to get anything solid. It took him 9 days. He sent me a secure link to a folder of files on a Saturday morning while Lisa was at the practice for a half day. I sat at the kitchen table in Jennifer's guest house, which was where we were still staying, and I opened the folder. There were photographs. Surveillance photographs, time-stamped and geotagged, taken over the course of 9 days at locations around Columbus. Lisa, meeting a man at a coffee shop on a Tuesday at 12:47 p.m. The man was dark-haired and broad-shouldered. He was older than in the photos in the blue album, more settled-looking, but I recognized him immediately. Danny. Lisa and Danny, at the coffee shop, leaning across the small table toward each other in a way that was unmistakably intimate. His hand on hers. Her laughing in that way she has, head tilted back. Lisa and Danny, outside a restaurant on a Thursday evening. The timestamp read 6:23 p.m. She'd told me that evening she was staying late at the practice for an emergency surgery on a dog that had been hit by a car. I'd texted her that I hoped the dog would be okay. She'd texted back a sad face emoji and said it was touch and go. The dog had apparently made a full recovery in time for Lisa to have dinner with Danny at an Italian restaurant on the east side of Columbus. There was more. Don had also done background on the men, which I'd requested. Daniel Hargrove, 39 years old, currently divorced, former Columbus resident who had moved to Pittsburgh 8 years ago, right around the time, I noted with a cold, sickening precision, that Lisa and I had started dating. He had moved back to Columbus 4 months ago. His LinkedIn said he was a regional sales director for a medical device company. 4 months. Lisa and Danny had been in the same city for 4 months. The affair had apparently resumed, or perhaps never truly ended, almost immediately. Don's written summary was careful and professional. He noted that he had not observed any physical contact beyond hand-holding, but that the nature and frequency of the meetings, combined with the secrecy surrounding them, strongly suggested an ongoing intimate relationship. He noted that Lisa had deleted her call logs after every communication with this number. He noted that she had a second email account, a Gmail address that used a version of her maiden name, that she accessed only from her phone. I read everything twice. Then I closed the folder and sat very still for a long time. The grief came first, the way it always does. 6 years of marriage. A house we'd bought together, now damaged by flood. We'd talked about children, not urgently, but the conversation had been there, warm and future tense, a door neither of us had closed. I thought about the life I believed I was living, and I felt the loss of it like something physical, like something being surgically removed. But underneath the grief, something else was already moving. Cold. Clear. Focused. She wanted to betray me. Fine. But she was not going to walk away from this clean. Jennifer, it turned out, had always been slightly reserved in her opinions of Lisa. I'd taken it as normal sibling complexity, the way sisters sometimes hold things back, and when I sat down with her that Sunday evening and told her what I'd found, I watched her face move through an expression that was not entirely surprise. I always wondered, she said quietly, about that Danny. She mentioned him once, years ago, before you two got together. She said he was the one she couldn't get over. I didn't think, she shook her head. Richard, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, I said. Be helpful. Jennifer was helpful. She was loyal in the way that some people are when they're presented with a clear moral situation. She'd been fond of me, she had a sense of right and wrong, and her sister had wronged someone she cared about. She agreed to let me keep staying at her house without telling Lisa that anything had changed. She agreed to keep our conversations private. She started paying attention to details she might previously have let go. My best friend from college, a man named Tom who'd been my best man at the wedding, drove up from Cincinnati when I called him. He sat across from me in a diner booth and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the qualities that has always made Tom an exceptional friend. When I finished, he said, "Tell me what you need." "I need to not do anything stupid," I said. "I need to be smart." "Then let's be smart," Tom said. "What does she have that you need to protect?" We started making a list. The house, even flood damaged, was in both our names and represented the largest single asset we had. Lisa's veterinary practice was her own, premarital, though I'd contributed significantly to its expansion costs during our marriage, a new ultrasound machine, renovation of the exam rooms, a business loan I'd co-signed. We had joint savings accounts, a joint investment account, 2 cars, and various smaller shared assets. I'd also, over the course of our marriage, taken on more of the domestic and logistical labor during periods when her practice was growing, cooking, managing contractors, handling household administration, which had a real value that Ohio's equitable distribution laws would recognize. I called our family attorney, a woman named Beverly Park, on Monday morning and told her I needed to discuss a divorce. She was discreet and experienced, and she set an appointment for that same week. I brought Don's file with me, along with my own documentation, bank records, loan documents, records of the house renovations I'd managed and partially funded. Beverly was methodical and thorough. She told me exactly where I stood and exactly how to protect my interests. She told me to stop contributing to any joint accounts immediately and to open a personal account at a different bank. I did it that same afternoon. I also called Lisa's business partner, a vet named Kevin, who handled the administrative side of the practice. Kevin and I had always gotten along well, we'd shared a few beers at practice events over the years. Kevin didn't know anything, that much was clear when I spoke with him, but he mentioned, without knowing why it mattered, that Lisa had recently discussed using some of the practice's expansion fund for a personal expense that she'd said was related to flood recovery. He wasn't sure it was appropriate but didn't want to make it an issue. She was using practice money for something personal. I told Beverly. I spent 2 weeks being very, very calm. I continued staying at Jennifer's house, and Lisa continued to interpret my quietness as stress over the flood damage. She was not entirely wrong. The house situation was genuinely stressful, the insurance claim was complicated, and I was coordinating contractors. But mostly I was quiet because I was building. I was methodical and I was thorough, and I was not going to give her a single moment's warning. There's a particular kind of power in knowing something that the other person doesn't know you know. I'd never understood that before. Now I understood it completely. Every time Lisa kissed me goodbye in the morning, every time she mentioned working late, in a tone calibrated to sound casual, every time she looked at me with that careful attention that was guilt trying to perform normalcy, I felt the terrible clarity of what I knew and what she thought she'd hidden. I used that clarity to stay sharp. I used it to get everything in order. The moment I'd been waiting for came on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the flood. We were back in the house, the first floor had been dried, the ruined flooring replaced with temporary materials, the damaged furniture removed. It was livable, if sparse. We were having dinner. I'd made pasta, the kind of ordinary domestic moment that was now coated in something I could barely look at, and Lisa's phone buzzed on the table. She reached for it reflexively, glanced at the screen, and something crossed her face. She set the phone face down and said nothing. I said, "Is that Danny?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. She looked up at me very slowly. Her face was doing something complicated, shock, guilt, calculation, and underneath it all, something that might have been relief, the way people sometimes feel relief when the thing they've been dreading finally arrives. "What?" she said. The word was almost inaudible. "Daniel Hargrove," I said. 39 years old, regional sales director, moved back to Columbus 4 months ago. The men whose photograph album you saved from the flood instead of our wedding pictures. The men you've been having dinner with on Thursday evenings while you told me you were doing emergency surgery. The men you've been meeting for coffee on Tuesday afternoons. Is that him?" She said nothing. Her face had gone white. "I want you to tell me how long," I said. My voice was very steady. I'd practiced this, in my head, for 3 weeks, and I was not going to give her the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. Not yet. Not here. I want you to tell me how long this has been going on, and I want you to tell me the truth, because I have hired a private investigator and I have documentation, so anything you lie about I will know you're lying about. And then Lisa did the thing I was not prepared for, even though I should have been. She cried. Not performative tears, not manipulation, or if it was manipulation, she was very good at it, but I don't think it was. I think she was genuinely, devastatingly sad. She put her face in her hands and she cried, and when she finally looked up at me, she said, "He came back in June. We had coffee, just once. I thought it would be just once. I thought I could have coffee with him and closed the door on it, and it didn't." She stopped. "I'm sorry, Richard. I'm so sorry." "How long before June?" I asked. "What? How long before he moved back were you in contact with him?" She closed her eyes. "We'd been texting, on and off, for about a year. Nothing happened. It was just, we never really." She stopped again. "You never really got over him," I said. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "The album," I said. "You kept it the whole time. Hidden from me." "I didn't hide it, you hid it," I said. "Because I've been through every shelf of that house and I've never seen it. And when the flood came, when everything was at risk, you grabbed it before you grabbed our wedding pictures. That tells me everything I need to know about where we actually stood." She was crying again. "That's not fair. Tell me something that is fair about any of this." My voice was still steady. I was proud of that, and I hated that I was proud of it. "Tell me one fair thing about the last 4 months. About the last year of texts. About the dinner you had on the 10th of this month when you told me the dog didn't make it through surgery. Was there even a dog, Lisa?" The look on her face confirmed it. There was no dog. There never was. "We're done," I said. "Richard, I want you to listen to me carefully," I said. "I'm not done talking. I need you to hear what I'm telling you." I reached under my side of the table and picked up the folder I'd put there before she came home, and I set it on the table between us. "Beverly Park is handling the divorce. I've already spoken to her, I've already filed, and she'll be reaching out to whatever attorney you choose. The house goes into proceedings as a shared marital asset. The business loan I co-signed, and the renovation expenses I covered for the practice. Beverly has documentation of all of that, and we will be seeking reimbursement as part of the settlement. I've also flagged to Beverly the issue of practice funds being used for personal expenses unrelated to the practice, and she'll be following up with a forensic accountant. Lisa stared at the folder. The color had drained entirely from her face. Kevin didn't know what you were using the money for, I said. He's going to find out. Your business partner is going to find out. Because Beverly is going to have to access the practice's financial records as part of the settlement process, and anything in there is going to come out. Richard, please, I'm going to go stay with Tom for a while, I said, standing up. The house is in both our names so you can stay here. But I want you to know that the life you thought you had with me is over. Whatever you're building with Danny, I hope it's worth what it cost you. I picked up the bag I'd packed that morning, which had been sitting in the hallway closet, and I walked out the door. I didn't look back. I cried in the car, because I'm human and I'd loved her and the grief of it was immense. I gave myself the drive to Tom's house in Cincinnati to feel everything, the loss, the humiliation, the sadness of all those ordinary moments that were now revealed to have been built on something hollow. I listened to music I hadn't listened to since college, and I let myself break, and then I drove into Tom's driveway and I dried my face and I went inside. Tom's wife, a woman named Carol, made me a sandwich and didn't ask any questions. Tom sat with me until 2 in the morning. Neither of them made me feel pathetic, which was what I needed most. Over the following weeks, the legal machinery that Beverly had set in motion began to grind forward. Lisa had hired an attorney, a man named Paul Dutton, who was competent but working with a less complete information set than Beverly was. The forensic accountant Beverly brought in found that Lisa had transferred approximately $11,000 from the practice's expansion fund into a personal account over the preceding 6 months. Kevin was informed. He was furious, not at me, but at Lisa. They were equal partners in the practice, and she had taken money from their shared business without his knowledge. He filed a separate civil action against her for breach of fiduciary duty. Lisa's professional reputation in the Columbus veterinary community was not vast, but it was real, and the news traveled. Veterinary circles in mid-sized cities are tight. Kevin was well liked. When it came out, and it came out, because these things do, that she'd been misappropriating practice funds and Kevin was pursuing legal action, the ripple effect was significant. 2 veterinarians who had been referring complex cases to their practice stopped. A nonprofit animal shelter that had a contract with the practice for subsidized services put the contract on hold pending resolution of the dispute. I didn't orchestrate any of that. I simply allowed the consequences of what Lisa had done to exist in the open, rather than helping her manage them. The marital asset settlement was, in Beverly's words, favorable to me. Ohio's equitable distribution laws, combined with my documented financial contributions to the practice and to the marriage more broadly, resulted in an outcome that was fair without being vindictive. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted her to experience the full weight of what she'd chosen. Danny, it turned out, was not the fairy tale she'd preserved in that blue album. I didn't look into his life out of spite. I heard from Jennifer, who heard from a mutual friend of Lisa's, that things between them had grown complicated almost immediately once the divorce proceedings made the relationship public. His return to Columbus had been partly precipitated by his own recent divorce, and he was navigating his own legal and financial difficulties. The easy romance of secret Tuesday coffees and stolen Thursday dinners was apparently very different from the reality of building a life with someone who had just blown up her marriage. I heard, through Jennifer, that he'd pulled back significantly by February. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. I mostly just felt tired. I went to therapy, which I would not have predicted of myself 3 years earlier but which turned out to be one of the better decisions of my life. My therapist, a man named Dr. Elliot Webb, helped me understand something that I'd been circling around without landing on, that the flood had not broken my marriage. The flood had just turned on a light in a room that had been dark for a long time. Something in Lisa had never finished grieving Danny, had maybe been carrying that unresolved longing through our entire relationship, and while that didn't excuse what she'd done, understanding it helped me stop trying to find the moment when everything went wrong. There wasn't a moment. It was a slow erosion, mostly invisible, mostly underground. I stopped looking for a villain and started building a life. I was still working at the same firm, but I'd been passed over for a senior project manager position the previous year and had been quietly frustrated about it. The divorce, paradoxically, freed something up in me. I no longer had the same concerns about stability and risk that had made me cautious about pushing for what I wanted. I went to my director with a proposal for a new project management process I'd been developing, something I'd been holding back because I wasn't sure of the reception. The reception was better than I expected. By March, I was leading a pilot program. By June, it had been adopted company-wide, and the VP of operations had recommended me for the senior position that had been filled by someone else the year before. I got the promotion in July. It came with a 30% salary increase and the authority to build my own team. I moved into a new apartment in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, bright, modern, clean of any history. I joined a gym and discovered that I'd been using stress as an excuse not to take care of myself, and that removing the source of stress while adding physical effort produced a version of me that was noticeably different from the men who'd been quietly suffocating in a house full of things he didn't fully understand. I lost weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I slept better. I cooked for myself and rediscovered that I was actually good at it. Tom and Carol visited often. Jennifer remained in my life. She'd chosen me over her sister in a way that clearly cost her something, and I was aware of that cost and tried to honor it by being someone worth that loyalty. I made new friends through the gym, through work, through the neighborhood. My social life, which had narrowed considerably during the marriage in ways I was only now able to see, opened back up. I started dating again around 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I wasn't looking for anything particular. I'd been advised by Dr. Webb to resist the urge to find a replacement and to let things happen naturally, and that turned out to be good advice. I met a woman named Claire at a work event. She worked for an architecture firm that was partnering with my company on a mixed-use development. She was sharp and funny and direct, and she'd been through her own difficult relationship and wasn't interested in anything complicated or dishonest. We took it slow, which was right for both of us. With Claire, I learned what it was like to be with someone who was fully present. Someone who didn't have a blue album hidden somewhere, a door left half open to a past she couldn't let go of. Our conversations were about us and our lives and our actual future, not a performance of a future while something else lived in the background. It was a different quality of relationship than anything I'd experienced, and it took me a while to trust it, but it was real. The final encounter with Lisa came 14 months after the flood. I was at a Saturday farmers market in Columbus, the one at the North Market that I'd started going to regularly since moving to Short North. I was with Claire, who was looking at handmade pottery and debating between two mugs, and I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and Lisa was standing 5 feet away. She looked thinner than I remembered, and tired in a way that had settled into the skin around her eyes. She was wearing clothes that fit well but seemed somehow off, like they were part of a presentation she was making an effort to maintain. She looked like someone who had been through something difficult and hadn't entirely come out the other side yet. I looked at her and felt very little, which surprised me, not the absence of pain, because the pain was genuinely gone, but the absence of even anger. She just looked like a person I used to know. "Richard," she said again. Her eyes went to Claire and back to me. "Lisa," I said. My voice was easy, unhurried. "How are you?" She seemed to have planned something to say and to have lost it. I wanted, if I ever ran into you, I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I think about what I did to you and she stopped. Her eyes were bright. I think about the flood, and the album, and I know what that showed you. I knew it the moment you walked into that living room. And I want you to know that you didn't deserve any of it. I looked at her for a moment. Behind me, I could hear Claire set down the pottery mugs and quietly step back to give us space. She knew enough of the story to understand what this moment was. "I know I didn't," I said. "I figured that out a while ago." "Is that?" She glanced at Claire again. "Her name is Claire," I said. "She's good, Lisa. Really good." Something moved across Lisa's face. Regret, maybe, or the full arrival of consequences that had been arriving in pieces for over a year. She nodded. "I'm genuinely glad for you," she said, and I believed she meant it, which was its own strange thing. "I hope things get better for you," I said. And I meant that too, which surprised me even more. I didn't wish her suffering. I'd stopped wishing her suffering a long time ago, when I realized that her suffering had very little to do with my happiness. "Take care of yourself." I turned back to Claire, who had picked up one of the mugs and was examining it with great concentration. I put my hand on her back and she looked up at me with that direct, clear expression she always had. "The one on the left," I said, "about the mugs." She looked at them both again, nodded seriously, and said, "You're right," and turned to the vendor. I didn't look back at Lisa. Not because I was being dramatic, not because I was making a point, just because there was nothing there to look back at. That chapter was finished, completely, without remainder. What was in front of me was what mattered. Later that evening, Claire and I were on the couch in my apartment, her mug filled with tea, mine with coffee, watching something neither of us would be able to remember the next day, because we kept talking over it. I was telling her about a project complication at work and she was offering opinions that were sharper than most of my colleagues' opinions, and the dog we'd adopted together 3 months ago, a ridiculous golden retriever mix named Harold, was occupying 3/4 of the couch with no apologies. I thought about the flood. I thought about standing in that living room with water sliding across the floor, watching my wife hold something against her chest that wasn't our life. I thought about the moment I'd reached back for the wedding album she hadn't grabbed, and how I'd carried it upstairs and set it on the nightstand and how it had sat there, dry and saved, while everything it represented dissolved. I donated that album to a photo preservation charity, eventually. It hadn't felt right to keep it, and it hadn't felt right to destroy it, all those photographs of a life that had been real, even if it was over. Somewhere in a storage facility, our wedding pictures were being archived. They'd outlast what they'd recorded. I didn't have any particular feelings about that anymore. I was sitting next to Claire with Harold's head on my feet and a good cup of coffee going cold because the conversation was more interesting, and the apartment was warm, and the work I'd built over the last year, not just the job but the life, the therapy, the choosing to be strategic about my own recovery rather than drowning in it, had led me here. If Lisa hadn't saved the wrong album in the flood, I might have spent another 5 years in a marriage that was keeping us both from something better. The flood had done me a favor, in the end. The flood had turned on the light. Some years from now, if anyone asks me about the worst night of my life, I'll tell them about standing in a living room with water rising and watching my wife choose a past she'd never let go of over the future we were supposed to build together. And then I'll tell them about what happened after, how I'd been methodical and smart and had taken care of myself, how I'd let the truth do its work without flinching, how I'd rebuilt something from the flood-damaged materials of my own life and found that what I built was stronger than what had been washed away. I heard, eventually, through Jennifer and through the ambient information that flows through any city's social networks, that the Danny situation had resolved itself in the way that rebound relationships often do when the fantasy encounters daily life. Lisa was navigating the practice's recovery and the civil dispute with Kevin, which had settled but left marks on her professional standing. She was, by all accounts, managing. She was also, by all accounts, alone. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt nothing about that, which was its own kind of triumph. What I felt was this: Harold was snoring now, his head still on my feet, making it mildly difficult to shift position. Claire had moved on from my work project to telling me about a design dispute at her firm, gesturing with her mug for emphasis, and she had a small dried paint fleck on her left forearm from a project she'd been working on that morning that she hadn't noticed. The apartment smelled like the dinner we'd cooked together and the candle Claire had brought from her place that she kept leaving here, which I'd stopped mentioning because I liked having it there. Outside, Columbus was doing whatever Columbus does on a Saturday night. Inside, I had everything I needed. The man who had stood in a flooding living room, watching his wife choose the wrong album and understanding in an instant that he'd been living a partial truth, that man had done the work. He'd been strategic when it mattered. He'd been honest with himself about what he was owed and what he deserved. He'd let the grief be grief without letting it become the whole story. And now he was here, and here was enough. Here was more than enough. Here was everything.